This is going to be a relatively short program today, since, as you know, I'm in Switzerland, partly on leave, partly on work matters. But anyway, regardless of that, I have only a limited amount of time. So, once again, I'm going to return to events in Russia because we've now had speeches by President Putin and President Lukashenko of Belarus, both commenting about the Wagner mutiny, as they've decided to refer to it, and about the international situation. And also, we've had a lot of response from the West, from the Western governments, but especially, most specifically, from the government of the United States, discussing this mutiny and what went on. Now, there's also, of course, information about the ongoing war. Um, as far as I can see, the fighting on the battlefronts has continued much as previously. Ukraine has continued to attack in various places. They sent a landing party across the Dnieper River, which has tried to cling on to a small strip of land near the Antonovsky Bridge in Kherson region. It's been shelled and bombed and attacked by the Russians. There's only about 50 Ukrainian soldiers supposedly there. None of them equipped with heavy weapons. And the latest word is that the Russian military seems to be in the process of basically eliminating these soldiers who seem to have been sent on something of a suicide mission, or at least so it seems to me at the moment. There's also been more fighting on the Vremevka ledge in Zaporozhye region. There's also been more fighting in the Orekhov region. But overall, the situation on the battlefronts, at least in southern and on the southern and southeastern battlefronts, seems to be following the same pattern that we have seen for the last couple of weeks, ever since Ukraine began its offensive on the 4th of June. Ukrainian attacks, initially they tried to launch these attacks with armor attacking through minefields. This was apparently what they were told to do by the West. The idea was that this would be some kind of complex combined arms operation which would sweep through the Russian defenders, approach the heavy Russian fortified lines further south, and then break through them and push through towards Tokmak and Melitopol and ultimately the Sea of Azov within the space of a few days or weeks. Well, that didn't happen. And then around 10 days ago, Ukraine changed its tactics. It sought to achieve breakthroughs in a different way. Instead of sending lots of armored vehicles pressing forward on in a single advance, Ukraine instead sent light infantry, covered to some extent by artillery fire, also trying to break through. So far, they have again failed to break through, and it's important to stress that we are now we're coming close now to the end of June. There's been fighting for most of June across the southern fronts, and in no place has Ukraine actually reached any of the heavy fortifications that the Russians have built, of which there have been so many satellite films and photographs and pictures. Nowhere have the big Russian lines been reached, much less penetrated. And there seems to be also, alongside this, a very complex battle going on in the area of Artyomovsk, formerly Bakhmut. Ukraine is also apparently trying to attack there. It's been going backwards and forwards. Ukraine seems to be trying to attack towards Kleshcheyevka. This is a village not far from Ivanivska, which the Ukrainians have always held onto. Kleshcheyevka was captured from them by the Wagner organization, I think back in February. But anyway, there's been intense fighting going on there. Again, up to this time, Ukraine has achieved no breakthroughs, and in fact, there are some reports that in another part of the battle, this area of the battle, it is the Russians rather than the Ukrainians who appear to be advancing. And last but not least, on the more northerly fronts, the Russians definitely seem to be pressing forward, even though gradually and incrementally. They seem to be pressing forward slowly but determinedly towards Liman, recaptured by Ukraine over the course of its offensive in Kharkiv region in the autumn, and also successfully, the Russians also successfully pushing towards Kupiansk, which I suspect they do intend eventually to capture, but where they seem to be aiming firstly, as is their usual way, to interfere with the communications into Kupiansk. And of course, as all of this goes on, more Russian missile strikes across Ukraine, more Russian airstrikes, more Russian drone strikes across Ukraine, all of this going on all the time. And this fighting continues, and I expect that before long we will see that the coverage of the war starts to revert to that. I would just finish this brief summary of the situation on the battlefronts by saying that the United States, the US media, has actually said that US intelligence has noticed that there has been no weakening in Russian defense along any of the fighting lines, and that this appears to have come as something of a surprise. Apparently, the expectation, perhaps the hope, was that the confusion in the rear, in Russia itself, would have an effect on the front lines, that the troops there would become upset, demoralized, worried about what was happening. But this didn't happen. And that brings me back to the main topic of this program, which will be the speeches of President Putin and of President Lukashenko. Now, before I press on with this, there is something I must say, firstly, about some of the comments that have been made in the West by many other people around the world, by some people even on threads of these programs that I've made. And they often talk about this affair, the Prigozhin affair, and they all talk about the fact, all kinds of things about this affair, and suggest that it has left Putin's position overall weakened, the Russian government's position overall weakened, that it's created an atmosphere, a climate of instability within Russia. I think the most important fact to understand about the Prigozhin affair is that it failed. It was a complete failure. It was a failure within 24 hours of its launch. Prigozhin, when he ordered his troops into Rostov region and sent a flying column of armored vehicles trundling towards Moscow, according to him, they got within 200 kilometers of the capital. According to other people, they didn't get anywhere near that close. But anyway, when he did that, he made it quite clear that his purpose was to carry out a major purge of the Russian Ministry of Defense. He wanted the Russian Defense Minister, Sergei Shoigu, sacked. He wanted General Gerasimov, the Chief of the General Staff, sacked. He wanted what he called impartial investigations to be launched to examine his various grievances and the almost certainly fictitious attacks that he claimed had been launched against his men by the forces of the Russian Ministry of Defense. By definition, whatever investigations he put together would not have been impartial. But anyway, he wanted that also, and he has got none of those things. We've now had film of Shoigu continuing to do his work as defense minister. There's no sign that he is going anywhere. We've not seen much of General Gerasimov, but he tends to be a somewhat invisible figure. This is very much in the traditions, by the way, of the German General Staff, which used to say that a staff officer should be invisible. But anyway, General Gerasimov has kept his peace, which is, in my opinion, both unsurprising and wise in the circumstances. It would have been a political red rag to have wheeled out Shoigu and Gerasimov over the course of this crisis, and might have actually won more support for Prigozhin within the Wagner organization. So keeping them out of sight whilst the affair was underway was a politically astute move, but there is no sign as of this time that either man is going anywhere. And the only concessions that were made to Prigozhin was that he himself would be allowed to go to Belarus, and that the charges against him would be dropped on condition that he did, and that the members of the Wagner group who participated in his armed mutiny, and now people seem to be agreeing on a total of 8,000, but without any of the actual officers being involved. We're now told, by the way, that the Wagner force amounts to 32,000 men, so just around a quarter of them participated in this mutiny that Prigozhin led. Anyway, that these men would be amnestied. Now, again, there's been some dispute about whether or not Prigozhin's agreement to go to Belarus was actually an agreement to go into exile in Belarus. I pointed out in one of my earlier videos that if he were to return to Russia, the Russians have potential criminal charges of fomenting an uprising, of potential treason, the word that Putin used in his first address to the nation when the Prigozhin affair got underway, and also potentially of murder consequent upon the killing of Russian servicemen by Wagner forces. And Prigozhin himself has now admitted that an Ilyushin-22 military reconnaissance aircraft was shot down by the Wagner troops over the course of this affair, with the crew of that aircraft all being killed. So there are potential criminal charges that can be brought against Prigozhin. Now, Prigozhin hung around in Russia for a couple of days after his agreement to basically give up. But yesterday, the TASS news agency reported that the case against him was still live, and then a few hours later, we got the news that his private jet, presumably with him inside, had landed in Belarus, and then, but only then, did we get the report that the case was dropped. Now, the case has been dropped. It is not, however, as lawyers say, a case of res judicata. It's not a case of the case having gone to court and have been rejected by the courts. It can be revived at any time if Prigozhin re-enters Russia without permission. It will be revived. And we've also had confirmation of much of what I have been saying about the Wagner organization. Wagner troops have been invited to sign contracts with the Ministry of Defense, provided they did not themselves participate in the mutiny, and it seems many of them are now doing so, and it also seems that all of Wagner's heavy weapons, its tanks, its armoured vehicles, its self-propelled guns, its Grad multiple rocket launcher systems, are now being surrendered to the Ministry of Defense as well. So that is the situation. There's more reports that Wagner troops who might want to join Prigozhin in Belarus are going to be allowed to do so. There's a report that the Belarusian authorities have agreed to set up camps to receive them. John Helmer, that most experienced and insightful and well-informed commentator about Russian affairs, has suggested in an article he did in his website Dancing with Bears that the ultimate destination, both of Prigozhin and of whatever soldiers follow him, will be in Africa. They'll be packed off to Africa, to Mali or the Central African Republic or one of those places to carry on the fight against jihadi terrorist fighters there. It looks as if Belarus itself will only be a staging post. So, to repeat again, Prigozhin achieved nothing. None of his objectives were realized. The entire uprising was quelled before it started, and this was achieved successfully by the Russian authorities, and it is important to understand, first and foremost, that this was a complete and total failure. It was also a failure. It was also a failure, and one of the reasons why it became a failure was because no part of the Russian political system, or of Russian society, or of the Russian military or security complex supported Prigozhin. The entire attempt, the entire mutiny, coup in my opinion, was predicated on the assumption that there would be support for it from someone in Russia. The fact that there was no support from any party at all points to the strength of the Russian government and President Putin's position, and of the stability of the Russian political system. It does not point to any weakness. Now, this has been my analysis. I've set it out several times over a course of several videos, and in fact, we've now had comments, words from President Putin himself. He's just delivered an address, another address to the Russian people, in which he makes exactly those points. And he also makes the point that Russian society did not support this mutiny. He also made the point that the bulk of the Wagner forces did not support the mutiny, together with all of Wagner's officers. Prigozhin was left entirely by himself, and except for the 8,000 or so fighters that he was able to bring over to his side. And on the one hand, Putin says that this does testify to the consolidation, the extent of the consolidation within Russian society. But he also makes it clear that despite the fact that no legal action has been taken against Prigozhin, his own sentiments about what has taken place have changed in no respect from what he said in his address to the Russian people, which he made whilst the mutiny was underway on Saturday. He continues to see this whole affair as, in effect, a stab in the back. He made that absolutely clear. He also made it clear that as far as he is concerned, this whole affair was dangerous. It had the potential to create great disturbance within Russia. And he also says that the only reason that legal action has not been pressed against Prigozhin, and the only reason why the Russian military did not act immediately to quell this uprising by force, was because he, Putin, took the wise and correct political decision. I say wise and correct political decision because that is my opinion, to place Prigozhin in a checkmate position and to offer him a way out, which is this exile in Belarus. And Putin makes exactly the points I made in my previous programs, that this was done in order to avoid not just the fighting in Russia, which would have been a terrible thing in itself, but all appearance of a civil war. And Putin acted from a position of strength. Prigozhin was in a checkmate position. He had no realistic option but to back down and agree to go to Belarus if he didn't want, most likely, to be either killed in the fighting or to be sent to prison for the rest of his life. So that is the point. Those are the points that Putin made. The purpose of his speech yesterday, in my opinion, was to explain to the Russian people not just that the crisis is over, but to explain why he, Putin, decided against the use of violence in order to suppress this mutiny, given the overwhelming political support behind the government, given Prigozhin's and the mutineers' total isolation. Putin could afford to act in that way, and he did so in the larger interests. And I think he was right. Now, we have also had a most interesting speech from President Lukashenko, who it is now clear is acting increasingly as part of Putin's team. And he also spoke about the extremely dangerous events that had shaped out in Russia. But very interestingly, he linked the stability of Russia with the stability of Belarus. He pointed out that there is a regiment of Belarusian dissident volunteers fighting alongside the Ukrainian army. He said that when they heard news of Prigozhin's moves in Russia itself, these people wanted to be transferred to advance on Belarus as well. He said that this didn't happen because the border control troops of Belarus basically turned them back, but he said that the situation on Belarus's borders is continuously tense. And of course, the Russians are now shortly going to deploy nuclear weapons in Belarus. It could be, as some people think, that the Wagner fighters that are going to be transferred to Belarus will be invited to help Lukashenko strengthen Belarus's defences. I said previously, and I retain this view, I doubt actually that Lukashenko has much trust either in Prigozhin or in Wagner, and I explained that events that took place in 2020 basically show that Lukashenko has little trust or confidence in these people. I continue to share Helmer's view that eventually these people will all be packed off somewhere else, possibly to Africa, and that these camps that have been set up in Belarus are intended purely as transit camps for when these fighters, such as them as choose to go, decide to go there. Unless they of course decide to stay in Russia, which is quite likely of quite a few of them. Now, I'm going to finish on Prigozhin. I personally would not be surprised if, in spite of everything, he eventually ends up in the West, or conceivably even Ukraine, but more possibly the West. And I think people should be prepared for that, and they should also be prepared for a long list of declarations, proclamations, all sorts of activities on Prigozhin's part if he does go to the West, and quite conceivably he will team up with all sorts of interesting people there. Now, in saying that, that is not a prediction. It's just something I think is not inconceivable. We will have to see what he does do. But if he does do that, then his prospects of a political role in Russia itself will disappear, and perhaps that might be something that he does not want to do. But anyway, that is the situation with the Prigozhin mutiny. It is ended, it has failed, and it has failed entirely on Putin's terms, and Putin's authority has been enhanced. It's been enhanced in an important way, because those who have in Russia who have previously been critical of his conduct of the war, who have shared some of Prigozhin's criticisms of the way in which the war has been conducted, and who have shared Prigozhin's criticisms of the leadership of the Ministry of Defense, of people like Shoigu and Gerasimov, felt obliged, whilst this mutiny was underway, to back Putin against Prigozhin, and that will have undercut significantly their ability to cause Putin more problems in future. Whilst they are not a large part of Russian society, that element does exist, and it has posed a problem, a certain political problem for Putin in the past. Lastly, I'm going to talk briefly about the response in the West. And the most important thing here is the extraordinary efforts that the United States government has been making to reassure the Russians, and that is the right word, by the way, that they had absolutely nothing to do with this affair at all. Apparently there's been communications from the US Embassy in Moscow to the Russian ministries. There's also been communications to the Russian Embassy in Moscow. There have been statements to this effect by President Biden and by Secretary Blinken. There have been statements by the United States that they don't want to see this sort of instability in Russia because they're concerned about what might happen to the country's nuclear facilities, its nuclear arsenal. And the United States has gone out of its way ever since the mutiny collapsed to dissociate itself entirely from it. Now, that, for the moment, I am going to go with. It's interesting that up to this point, the Russian authorities have not said that Prigozhin acted at the instigation of any Western intelligence agency, or indeed even of Ukraine. I said in the past, in various videos, that there were several people in Russia itself who thought that might be the case, but the Russian government has been careful so far to make no such allegation, and the United States is denying it. So, we'll just have to see how things pan out. There is still apparently investigations going on into the source of the mutiny, and though Prigozhin himself is now out of reach, some of his people are not, and I'm pretty sure that Russia's formidable internal security apparatus, the FSB, the National Guard, all of these people will be putting the Wagner fighters, members of Prigozhin's team, under careful scrutiny, finding out exactly what it was that went on, trying to establish what the connections were. Having said that, and having taken into account these denials, which I accept at an official level, it still remains for me interesting, tantalizing, that the Western powers seem to have had some foreknowledge that this event was going to take place, and also greater foreknowledge than they have admitted to. As I said, there are lots of articles in the British media about Prigozhin leading some kind of a coup against the Kremlin, which went on for weeks and months before the mutiny on Saturday got underway. I wonder whether that was just successful deduction or guesswork, or whether there weren't some rumours filtering through, whether Prigozhin, even if he had not been exactly put up to do this by the West, perhaps was in contact with certain sources who had access to the West, perhaps Ukrainian sources. There's been confirmation, never denied even by Prigozhin himself, that Prigozhin has had contacts in various African countries with Ukrainian intelligence. He supposedly even tipped off Ukraine as to the whereabouts of Russian military units in return for promises not to attack his own Wagner forces. So whether perhaps Prigozhin was in contact with the Ukrainians maybe in some way, and whether the Ukrainians were passing on information about this to the West. This is purely a guesswork so far. It might, however, have facilitated some of the Western planning, some of the Ukrainian planning over the offensive. Maybe when Ukraine launched this offensive, they were expecting that a Prigozhin strike would create a political crisis in Russia, and were keeping their fingers crossed and were expecting that to happen. But in the event it didn't, and as a result, as we've seen, the Russian front lines have held. Now, to repeat again, in terms of his own domestic authority, Putin has emerged strengthened from this affair rather than weakened. I understand that this theory that Putin is weakened continues to be the prevailing sentiment in the West. There's been the first article today in the Daily Telegraph, by the way, which sort of suggests that the opposite might be true, that Putin has emerged from this stronger rather than weaker. But it's clear to me that this is the reality. One has to say again, this was not an enterprise, a venture that Putin and the Russian government expected or wanted or planned for. It's certainly not, in my opinion, 3 or 4 or 5 dimensional chess or anything like that. But perhaps they also had hints that some problems with Prigozhin were happening, were festering, and one way or another, either because they'd prepared for it or because they thought on their feet quickly, they handled this whole affair with consummate skill, and as a result have emerged the winners. Well, that's my program today. One last program, I think, about Prigozhin. I hadn't expected Mr. Putin and Lukashenko to speak. We'll see whether there's any more from this. But with Prigozhin now in Belarus, I really do think that this is the end of the affair. Well, thank you for joining me again today. As I said, a shorter video today. As I said, I am on leave, and more from me soon. and have a very good day. Just to remind you all, you can find all our programs on Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin, and Telegram. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Don't forget to check out our shop and get yourself all the great things that you will find there. Our mugs, our hats, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you like this video, this short video, please tick the like button and check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon, and have a very good day.